Good evening. It's an honor to be here. I was so excited when I heard that Fresno was doing a Christian apologetics conference with Dr. Craig Hazen and Dr. Bloom from Biola. I was like, I've got to be there. And then they asked me to speak at it, and I don't know how that happened. Here's the scary moment where we see if my remote control works. Yes, okay, cool. Everyone's phones must be off. I was in the Denver airport a couple of years ago on a layover from Wichita on my way to Fresno, because of course there's only three places you end up on a layover to Fresno: Denver, Phoenix, or LAX. And so I was in Denver this particular day. I sat across from a woman in her late 30s, a businesswoman, and she asked me what I do. And I hate that question, because I'm the education director for Right to Life of Central California, and I don't know how to answer that question. Like, who wants to talk to the abortion guy? And so I described what I did for her in a way I'd never said before, and I hope it doesn't offend you, but basically I just told her, I said, I try to help pro-life people to become more persuasive and less weird. And she asked, what does that mean? And I said, well, I'm trying to help pro-life people to use more good arguments and less bad ones. And I want to help pro-life people also to be more relational, to connect better with people who are pro-choice, and people who maybe just didn't grow up in the same faith background that sometimes we did. I want us to connect better while we communicate with them and to be more persuasive. And that work involves analyzing lots of arguments and actually going out into the field, if you will, and trying them out. So I have about 1,000 conversations with real pro-choice people under my belt, just trying different things. Just seeing what seems to be persuasive and then analyzing the things that they say so that I make sure that I'm understanding their argument well enough so that I can work with my colleagues who are a lot brighter than me at trying to find the best responses. And what I found over the last 10 years of full-time pro-life work is that the most common pro-life arguments that are used by not philosophers, but just kind of us on the grassroots level, the arguments that we use the most often, I think, are not that persuasive to most pro-choice people. And the most persuasive arguments that we have in the movement, we're not using that much. So that's a problem. I don't think that us becoming more persuasive is a sufficient condition for ending abortion. There's more that's necessary. But I think it's probably a necessary condition. I think we need to get more persuasive if we're going to persuade more people to become pro-life, which is a necessary condition of making abortion illegal, which is our ultimate goal. And so this is kind of the niche, the narrow area that I'm devoting myself to, is to take my experience of talking to pro-choice people, including some good friends of mine. I've got pro-choice friends that I've had for years, and we just talk about this stuff. We'll Skype for 3 hours and try arguments. It's really fun. And use that to help pro-life people to become more persuasive. So a little background. I want to give you the forest there's kind of three categories of pro-choice arguments as they relate to the unborn. And we're not going to talk about all of this today, but I want you to kind of understand what area we're focusing on today, because I've only got like 40 minutes. There's a category where people are assuming that the unborn are not fully human. The central question in the abortion debate is, what is the unborn? I don't think it's the only question that matters, but it's kind of the central one. It's the one that makes sense to talk about first before you talk about anything else. And there's a lot of pro-choice people that when they talk about abortion or they make an argument for keeping abortion legal, they make an argument that's clearly assuming, before you even get going, that the unborn is not a valuable human being like you and me. A lot of times they're going to talk about the circumstances of the woman, poverty, or she might lose her scholarship, or it's going to be difficult for her career. Overpopulation is where I would put this argument. So that's just one category. We're not going to talk about that at all today. There's a second category where people are actually making arguments that the unborn are not fully human. But what's important to realize is there's two subcategories under here. See, what's really important for me is that I don't straw man the person I'm talking to. I don't know if you're familiar with the term straw man, but it's like this idea of building up this kind of, like, we don't want to take their argument and dumb it down and then attack this dumbed down argument. We want to really understand where they're coming from. So like when someone says, well, no one knows when life begins, my mentor Steve Wagner, Justice for All, has taught me that it's really important before you go into like an embryology speech to ask them a clarification question. Did you mean that no one knows when biological life begins? Or did you mean maybe that we don't know when like philosophical, like something like important life begins, like when a person begins? And in my experience on college campuses, people usually mean the latter. So sometimes people are making biological arguments that the unborn is not human, like they might say it's not alive or it's not a member of the human species, or more often that it's not an organism, that maybe there's no real difference between a zygote and a bodily cell. But then there's this other category. People are making philosophical arguments that the unborn is just not like us. It's not a person. It's not valuable. It might be a human, but it's not a human that morally matters. And that's a different argument. And then there's this third category that's really interesting that most pro-life people don't even know exists, of bodily rights arguments, where they're actually admitting that the unborn is fully human and saying we can kill them anyway. And these are bodily autonomy arguments. In fact, there's actually two subcategories of this. My friend Trent Horn at Catholic Answers worked this out, that there's really two different types of bodily rights arguments. We're not doing this today, but there's a kind of group that we call sovereign zone arguments, where they're arguing that a woman's body is kind of like a sovereign zone, that anything inside her body she can do anything she wants with. And then there's this other argument, I think it's actually better, that we call right to refuse argument, where they would say, well, maybe you can't do anything you want with anything inside your body, but at the very least, a woman should have the right to refuse to have her body being used as a life support machine. So this is where Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist analogy would come in. So today, we are only going to talk about this group, just philosophical arguments that the unborn is not a person. This is what we're going to focus on today because it's all I've got time to really do adequately. But I'm hoping that maybe you're intrigued about this third category of arguments, that maybe we should be thinking of good ways to respond to that. And if you are intrigued by that, I've got a website address I want you to write down. If you go to joshbrahm.com/DFG, which stands for De Facto Guardian, you can access a speech audio as well as a paper that my friend Steve Wagner wrote with a couple of colleagues of mine and myself, trying to give a better response than we've had in the past to the strongest versions of bodily rights arguments. So some people have found that it's helpful to listen to the speech first and then read the paper. But I hope that you're interested in knowing how to recognize bodily rights arguments when you hear them, because I think a lot of times we hear them and then we don't recognize them, and then we strawman the person. We don't want to do that. That's all I'm going to say about that. So, personhood arguments. If someone says they think that the unborn is not a person, what they mean usually is that there's something really important that's different between the unborn and us, that the unborn is a different kind of thing. It might be a member of the human species. It might be a member of the species Homo sapiens. But it doesn't morally matter. It shouldn't have basic rights yet, like the right to life and liberty and so on. And I'm always going to start this conversation the same way. I'm going to give you a couple of options of where to go later if you want to go deeper, but I'm going to start my conversation the same way, with something that we're calling the equal rights argument. This is not my argument, so don't source this to me. In fact, we believe the first person we heard make this argument was actually Dr. J.P. Moreland at Biola, who we're big fans of. And he made an argument very similar to the way that we cast this out. But we had noticed that a lot of pro-lifers hadn't used this particular argument the way J.P. Moreland does, and we started trying it on campuses a couple of years ago as like a test, because we really like R&D. We're weird that way. And what we found is that this is the most persuasive argument we've ever used. I've never seen anything change so many people's minds from going from pro-choice to pro-life. Like in the past, we hadn't seen very many people change their minds at all. I mean, and we kind of just chalked that up to, well, everyone, has a certain level of what my brother Tim calls pig-headedness, where we all think that we're right about everything, and it takes us a long time to change our views about things, especially deep, important, emotional issues like abortion. Now I'm thinking, well, maybe we just weren't being persuasive enough, because last August, for example, I went to Washington, D.C., to train the staff of this amazing national pro-life organization called Students for Life of America. We did an all-day training on Friday, and then the next morning we went out to the streets of D.C. just to talk to people, which pro-life people don't do enough, to actually talk to real pro-choice people. And so we went to do that just for a couple of hours before I had to go to the airport. And during that 2 hours, a small group of us talked to 7 people who were strongly pro-choice that by the time we were done had become pro-life. And that might not seem like a lot to you, but in 2 hours with a small group of people, those are really, really impressive numbers. And so I've come to believe that this argument is the most undervalued argument in the pro-life movement. And I'm really excited to tell you about it, because this is what we've been using. The equal rights argument is 3 basic questions. Do we deserve equal treatment? Do people deserve equal treatment? And then doesn't that mean there's something the same about us, which leads us to the third question, what's the same about us? So here's how this would work in a real-time dialogue. I was at Fresno State University a couple of years ago in the spring, and I talked to a student named Michael. And Michael, at some point, this is a really good conversation. We both enjoyed each other. It's great. And at some point, Michael said he didn't think the unborn were persons. And I said, Michael, let's take a break from talking about the unborn for a little while, which is not what we expect full-time pro-life advocates to say. I said, let's just take a break from talking about the unborn. Let's talk about someone more obvious. Do you think all the people you can see right now, do they deserve equal treatment? So I said, so we're outside at Fresno State. We're near the big fountain. And I said, so the group of students over there and him and her over there, do they all deserve to be treated equally? And Michael said, yeah. And I said, why? I said, that might be one of the weirdest things I've ever heard. And Michael said, what do you mean? I said, well, we're all so different. I mean, right now, I see people who are tall and people who are short. I see people who are really smart, and I see some people who are trying their best. And if you expand it beyond the scope of the borders of the Fresno State campus to the entire city of Fresno, you'd have people like my friend Sarah, who's in a wheelchair. And you'd have people who are really good at music and sports and people who are not. You'd have people who are in temporary or medically induced comas and those who are not. How can we possibly explain this intuition that we both have, as does most of Western civilization, that we should all be treated equally? When we're all so different, how can we possibly explain that? And Michael said, I don't know, but that's interesting. Like he's enjoying himself. He's not frustrated. It's not like I just gave him this impossible Lord of the Rings riddle. Like he was like, oh, this is kind of cool. I've never thought about this before. And I said, well, let me give you a hint. I've been thinking about this lately, and I've got this idea that might help us find the answer. I said, it seems to me that if we should all be treated equally, then that must mean that we all have something in common. And this is key. It's got to be something that we all have equally. We're talking about a property right now, if you're into philosophy, if you're a nerd like me. It's got to be a property that we all have equally. It cannot be something that comes in degrees. It can't be something that you can have more or less of. It can't be something like size or intelligence. Like if someone said, well, all humans should be treated equally because we're all intelligent. That's not going to do the job of explaining equal treatment. Why? Because we're not all equally intelligent. If you don't believe me, go to youtube.com and read the comments under any video. You can start with mine. Go to youtube.com/lifereport, find our most viewed videos, and read the comments under it. Some people think better than others. And there's people in this room, like Dr. Bloom, who thinks way better than I do. And yet I still think we have an equal right to life. Like I'm not going to go into an IQ match with Dr. Bloom. That would be silly. But yet I still think we have an equal right to life, that we deserve to be treated equally. So it can't be about intelligence. We've got to ground that in something else. It's got to be something that we all have equally. So it's got to be a non-degreed property. It can't be something that comes in degrees. It's got to be something that you either have it or you don't. And some people have a response. Some people have an idea of what that might be, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute. But Michael didn't. He didn't have any idea. So I said, and I actually let him think about it for a little while. I gave him like 9 seconds or so to think about it because I didn't want to I want them to do some of the work themselves. I don't want to put it together this puzzle like this one-man pro-life show, like ta-da, I want them to do some of the work. It'll be more persuasive to them in the long term. But Michael didn't have an answer, and I said, well, would you be interested in I think I might have an answer. And he said, yes, this is awesome. Okay, so this is good. And this is one option of several. This is the most basic version, and this is what I felt like I should do with Michael. I'm going to give you a couple of options a little bit later on. But what I told Michael that day at Fresno State was that, Michael, I think we all have humanness in common. I think we're all equally human. That's not a degreed property. It's not something you can have more or less of. It's an all or nothing kind of thing. It's like a light switch instead of a dimmer switch. You're either human or you're not. And I said, if humanness is the right answer to this, this riddle, then that actually explains a lot of data about the world around me. For example, it explains why racism is wrong. I think racism is wrong because it focuses on a surface difference that doesn't matter morally. And it focuses on, it chooses not to focus on the thing that actually matters. That what we all have equally, that we're all human, which is the thing that morally matters. Same thing with sexism. Sexism is wrong because it focuses on a surface difference that doesn't matter, and it ignores the thing that we all have in common, the thing that does morally matter, that we're equally human. And I said, Michael, if the unborn are human, then the unborn deserve to be treated equally as well. Now, some pro-choice people actually have alternative explanations. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper now, because so some people, pro-choice people generally agree that we should be treated equally. So some of the really smart pro-choice people that I talk to will actually have alternative explanations, a different answer to the riddle that is also a non-degreed property. It's also an all or nothing kind of thing that might work. And when I hear an explanation, then what I want to do is assess it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask myself 3 kind of test questions. It's like a rubric in my head that I'm going to filter their argument through as I try to assess what their argument is. And here's the test questions I'm going to ask. Does their explanation for equal rights entail equal rights for adults? It should. Like if it doesn't pass that test, it's not going to work, right? And then usually it will. Then I'm going to ask my second question. Does their explanation entail an equal right for infants? I think it should. If you're into epistemology, I'm purposely making a very particularist move here. I believe that the right to life of infants is a properly basic belief. Now, I can make arguments for that too, if I have to, but I'm not completely convinced that I should even have to. I think infants, having held now my 3 children, I'm pretty sure infants have a right to life. So I'm going to wonder, does their explanation entail an equal right to life for infants? And then I'm also going to ask, does their explanation entail an equal right for animals? Because I think it shouldn't. So that'll be so let me kind of show you how I would do this in real time. Let's say someone said, let's come up with a non-degreed property argument they could give. Let's say they say, you have to have had your first thought. Not that the better you think, the more valuable you are. That's clearly false. That would be a degreed version. What if they said, as soon as you've crossed the threshold of having had your first thought, whenever that is, as soon as that happens, you're in. You're in the human family, you're in the human community, and you get an equal right to life. That would be an all or nothing kind of answer. Maybe that would make sense of the equal rights for at least adults, which is kind of the most obvious part of this. Then I'm going to tell them a story that's going to help us assess this. And this is something my brother Tim came up with. My brother Tim is brilliant. He graduated from Biola's Torrey Institute. He's awesome. And he came up with this great thought experiment that's been very helpful on campuses. Say, imagine after doing philosophy for a couple of hours, we go and hang out at the zoo. Because why not? And we're hanging out at the zoo, and a gunman shows up and starts firing. And he gets 5 bullets shot off before he's tackled by Chuck Norris. And the first bullet goes into the bushes and kills the world's unluckiest cockroach. That's funny to me, too. If you're laughing, I think it's hilarious, the idea of a cockroach being that unlucky. I'm a little twisted. But that's funny to me. The second bullet kills a squirrel in a tree. But the third bullet kills a human infant. The fourth bullet kills a toddler. And the fifth bullet kills an adult stock photo model. Here's the question I'm going to ask. How many murders took place? Or how many of these killings should be considered murder? I'm not going to ask what the law is right now. What should the law be? In other words, how many entities were killed that is equally tragic? Because remember, we're trying to explain equal rights, that we should be treated equally. That's the point of the conversation right now. They're trying to give an alternative explanation. So if your view is that as soon as you've had your first thought, you're in, say, well, what would that mean in the zoo story? It seems to me that you have at least 4 murders. Maybe 5. I don't know enough about cockroaches yet to know if I think they think. At least to the level of what pro-choice people mean when they use the word think in this context, I'm not sure. Maybe if I learn more about cockroaches, I'll learn maybe they even fit. So then maybe we'd have 5. But we have at least 4. Squirrels think. Like they gather nuts and stuff. Like they do things that are, they've had a thought. It seems to me that this is a very big problem with their argument. In fact, I think this is the biggest problem with their argument. Pro-choice responses to equality, their alternative explanations tend to make at least one of 2 big mistakes that we're pointing out. Imagine there's an equal right to life circle. Everything that goes in the circle has an equal right to life. Everything out does not. Sometimes pro-choice arguments include too many into that circle. Sometimes the entire animal kingdom, depending on what their argument is. I don't think that's the right view. There's other arguments that'll exclude too many from the circle, like infants. I think that's the big problem with that view. And sometimes they'll actually have both problems at the same time. But in this case, it seems like suddenly the squirrel being killed is equally tragic with the toddler. And I don't think that's the world that I live in. I don't think we should mistreat animals. I just don't think that, like, if a farmer had a bunch of squirrels, digging up his crops, and he went out shooting, I'm not going to be like, whoa, that was this tragic genocide that happened. That's just not what's going to happen. That's not how I'm going to think about it. I'm going to think, okay, that's it. It's not going to be this huge thing. But what if they change targets? Now, maybe they might say, okay, that's a problem. Okay, so it can't be having your first thought, but maybe it's having rational self-awareness. Maybe as soon as you're rationally self-aware, you're in. Now, at this point, because I care very much about not strawmanning people, I got to play 20 questions. I've literally got to probably ask about 20 questions to try to find out what they mean by rationally self-aware. Because in my experience, people that use the term self-aware or sentient, they mean different things all the time. So I really want to ask a lot of clarification questions and figure out what is it that they mean by that. But let's just say the person gives me an answer. Let's just say we figure out this person is kind of a simplified version of Dr. Peter Singer's view. He would say that as soon as you're able to cognitively work out the concept that you're a unique entity that's going to exist over time. That's not all of Peter Singer's argument. It's a part of it. So say he's like, as soon as you can do that, you're in. I'm going to say, okay, cool. Now we've got something else to assess. Let's think about the zoo story. How many murders? I count 2. The toddler and the woman, but not the infant. I think that's a really big problem with the view. I think if your view correctly understood entails that infanticide would not be that morally problematic, I think that's at least a huge weakness of your view, if not a defeater of your view. And I'm going to ask some questions about that. Now, they might say, well, you've got to be able to sense pain at all. Okay, well, fine, then everyone. It's all murder. Because cockroaches can feel pain. Well, that doesn't seem like the right view. So you can see they tend to have at least 1 or 2 of these problems. They're either including too many in the equal right to life circle, like most of the animal kingdom, or they're excluding too many like infants. And those are the main problems I'm going to point out. There can be other problems too. There's counterexamples that sometimes we can offer about temporary comas and stuff, but this is usually where I want to go first. Now I want to make something really clear. I don't think that you have to have a religious discussion here, because the equal rights argument that I've presented doesn't refer to religion. I think an atheist could make the same argument and rationally be pro-life. So depending on your conversation, you might choose to focus on the fact that the pro-life view, that the unborn should be included because they have a human nature, makes the most sense of our moral intuitions. But sometimes this can be a great opportunity to make a defense for the hope that is in you, and gently challenge the atheist by asking her how she would explain why it is so wrong to kill humans. And what I want to do with the rest of my time tonight is give you 3, kind of a buffet of 3 options of positive arguments that you can make for fetal personhood. And I'm going to explain them both, like all the 3 of them briefly, and then we'll do maybe a couple of questions. The first argument I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail is the Humanist Argument, or the Imago Dei argument. Then I'm going to talk about the rational nature argument, and finally, this is a really cool one, the future of value argument. I put an asterisk on that one because some people would argue it's not technically a personhood argument, it's more of a it's wrong to kill certain humans argument. A lot of other people say it's kind of like a personhood argument, so whatever you want to call it. Here's the 3 things we're going to talk about tonight. So the humanist argument. Here, I'm going to put this in a syllogism form and then tell you basically how I say it on campuses. Basically, the argument, the way I cast it out, is all human organisms are persons. That's premise 1. Then premise 2, the unborn is a human organism. Conclusion / P3, therefore the unborn are persons. And then premise 4 is prima facie wrong to kill persons. Most people agree with that. And then my conclusion is, therefore, abortion is prima facie morally wrong. The way, look, when people, and I would actually make the argument that if people ask enough why questions, I think that I'm going to end up making kind of an Imago Dei type argument, an image of God argument. I would never use the phrase Imago Dei on campus. I don't think you should use Latin when talking to people, generally speaking, because it makes me look like a jerk. But it's an image of God type argument. I actually told someone on Facebook, I broke this rule like 3 months ago. This guy commented, and I commented back. I said that he was committing the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, and then I realized that seemed like a jerk. I shouldn't do that. So don't use Latin with people. This is generally speaking. Side note. But I think if they ask enough questions, I'm going to end up making a kind of an image of God kind of argument. So when people have asked me, so like, why does humanist matter? Why should I believe that humanist is the thing that matters? What I've been saying lately is I've just been kind of saying, I think humanist matters because I think there's this guy 2,000 years ago who walked out of his own tomb. You might have heard of him. And Jesus believed in the Torah. And the Torah said that God made humans in his own image, which means that God did something really special with humans that he didn't do with other animals. Which gives me a reason to think that being human actually might matter. And if Jesus actually did walk out of his own tomb, then I think there's a pretty good authority on this. A couple of notes about this argument. Some philosophers will respond, well, this is a very speciesist argument. Speciesism is kind of this term that Peter Singer has made famous. It's kind of like you have this irrational bigotry against all the other species. And my view is that this humanist argument, the way I'm making it, is not irrationally speciesist. I actually have a reason to believe that the species identity would matter, is that God did that God did something with members of this species. So I don't think this argument is circular. I don't think it begs the question. I don't think it's ad hoc. However, this is also important, I think. A commitment to the dignity of all human beings does not necessarily entail a denial of dignity for all the other animals that are not human. For example, I personally have pretty strong feelings against the annual dolphin slaughter that happens in an infamous cove in Japan. What I'm saying is I don't think that it is equally tragic when 250 dolphins are speared in that cove in Japan. I don't think that's equally tragic if 250 humans were killed. Does that make sense? I actually think we should treat dolphins well for their own sake, even though they lack equal moral status with human beings. But now I'm going to say something a little bit controversial. My view right now is that this argument is not always the optimal choice if you're talking to a philosophical atheist. And the main reason for that is that the humanist argument doesn't really account for the right to life of fictional aliens. And this actually comes up a lot on college campuses. In other words, atheists tend to want to have a reason for believing that Tommy Lee Jones' character in Men in Black should not kill Frank the Pug. You all remember the scene where he's interrogating? It's like one of the funniest things I've ever seen in cinematic history. He's interrogating, he's not really a pug, it's an alien, but he's like in the body of a pug. And he's really frustrated because he's not getting the answers that he wants. Imagine that Men in Black went a darker direction and Tommy Lee Jones gets really, really angry and just pulls out his pistol and blows Frank away. Why would that be wrong? Almost everybody agrees that there'd be something wrong with that. Well, we can't just say, well, it's because Frank's human. There's got to be some other reason. Now, I'm not saying I believe aliens exist. That's not the point. They probably don't. They might. I don't know. That's not the point. The point is, my really philosophical friends would really like to hear an argument from the pro-life movement that would explain why it would be wrong to kill non-human persons. I definitely think all humans are persons. Maybe there's non-human persons too. At the very least, angels are non-human persons. So for someone who's more philosophical, I'm going to offer the rational nature argument. So I'm going to get a little bit more philosophical. Are you ready for that? Is that okay? If this is too much for you, it's okay. If it goes over your head, it might hit the person behind you. So just buckle your seatbelt. That's a Greg Kokel quote. That's not mine. But basically, here's this in syllogism form, and then I'm going to explain a little bit about it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But if, for those of you that want to take this up a level and you're nerdy like me, then cool, here we go. You're going to enjoy this. Premise 1, a person is a being that belongs to a rational kind, i.e. the kind with the intrinsic capacity to develop rational function. I'm going to explain more about this in a minute. Premise 2, all human organisms belong to a rational kind. P3, the unborn human organisms. P4 is prima facie wrong to kill persons, therefore abortion is prima facie morally wrong. Okay, a couple of notes about this. Basically, we're wanting to argue that what matters is not your present capacities or your present abilities, but the kind of being you are. That will lead you to develop certain abilities, thus deserving of respect. So we believe a person is a rational substance or a rational moral agent, a being who maintains their identity through change and has a nature that orients itself toward a rational function. Josh, what do you mean by rational? I'm glad you asked. Rational meaning self-identity, comprehending reasons for actions, choosing to act, validly inferring reasons for acting, and making moral choices accordingly. It's helpful here to explain just a little bit the difference between intrinsic and instrumental value. Or as Christopher Casler says in his book, The Ethics of Abortion, my favorite book right now on abortion, he uses the terms endowment versus performance, but to mean the same thing. He says we don't want to view that humans are instrumentally valuable. That means that you're valuable based on the kinds of things that you can do functionally. That seems like a problematic view. We want to make a value that all humans are intrinsically valuable because of the kind of thing they are. So here's what Christopher Casler, how he explains it in his book. He says, the Endowment Account holds that each human being has inherent moral worth simply by virtue of the kind of being it is. By endowment, Casler writes, I mean that the being in question has an intrinsic, dynamic orientation towards self-expressive activity. Beings with endowments that orient them towards moral values such as rationality, autonomy, and respect merit inclusion as members of the moral community. I'm going to give you one more quote. This is when he explains the rational idea. He says, rational endowment is nothing other than the capacity, ability, or disposition, though perhaps not realizable, enjoyed only by whole living beings whose active self-development is aimed towards and whose flourishing consists in freedom and rationality. That was a mouthful. I'm going to say that again because this is really good. Rational endowment is nothing other than the capacity, ability, or disposition, though perhaps not realizable, enjoyed only by whole living beings whose active self-development is aimed towards and whose flourishing consists in freedom and rationality. So notice that we're not saying that what matters is that you're presently able to act rationally. Because then people say, well, then the unborn don't count. They're not rational yet. That's not what we're saying. We're saying what matters is the kind of being you are. That the kind of being you are that directs itself, that self-directs and self-develops towards rationality because of the kind of being it is. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about this one because in the last couple of minutes, I want to tell you about this really cool other argument that's a little bit less complicated but really interesting. Because this is a secular argument for personhood coming from a secular philosopher countering secular arguments against fetal personhood. This is super cool. I was at UC Irvine a couple of falls ago, and I was talking to this guy, and I kind of made him my go-to personhood argument, and he didn't really have a response. But it was summer, and he didn't have anywhere to go, so he was just hanging out. He didn't have a counter, and it's like we kind of ran out of steam a little bit, you know? And I decided, and there was no one else for me to talk to at the time. It was a really quiet moment. And so I decided, I kind of asked him, I said, can I just throw something else out at you? And he said, sure. And I said, well, there's this atheist philosopher named Don Marquis, who he wanted to answer the question, why is killing wrong? He said, it seems like killing is not just wrong because it makes the victim's family members and friends really sad. Like, that happens. That's wrong, but it doesn't seem like there's a primary reason why killing is wrong. So it doesn't seem like it's just that it makes the murderer like a worse person, like it harms their soul or their psyche. It seems like there's something else going wrong that's even more important. And he said it seems like the murder victim is wronged. And it seems like the best way to explain that is that the murder victim's been robbed. He's been deprived all the future valuable experiences that he would have valued. All those things that we basically all agree are valuable, like eating really good food and having good friends and falling in love and sex. All those things that generally we value, all those valuable experiences. Marquis says maybe the worst thing you could ever do to someone is deprive them of all those future experiences. And Marquis says it seems like that would be the way to explain, the best way to explain why it would be wrong to kill a young child. You're depriving them of their future experiences. And if the unborn are healthy, this isn't going to work for like severely disabled children that are going to die soon after birth. But if it's like most unborn children that are going to be healthy and have this future valuable experiences, it seems like that would mean abortion's wrong. And he was like, wow, that's really interesting. So he left. Greg Kokel talks about putting pebbles in people's shoe. This guy left with 2 pebbles in his shoe. He had 2 really good positive arguments he had no response to that he could chew on for hopefully the next couple of months. So here's the future value argument in syllogism form. Premise 1, killing is primarily wrong because it deprives the victim of all of the value of his or her future. Premise 2, a healthy fetus has the same kind of valuable future as a healthy newborn. Conclusion/premise 3, therefore it is as wrong to kill a healthy fetus as a healthy newborn. Premise 4 is prima facie wrong to kill a healthy newborn. Therefore is prima facie wrong to kill a healthy fetus. There's a lot of atheist pro-choice philosophers that think that this is the best argument the pro-life movement has. So sometimes I want to be ready to bring this out. This can be really helpful. Here's the one thing I will say about this, though. I make the argument a little bit differently than Marquis does as a Christian. Marquis would say that having a future of valued experiences, or sometimes he says future like ours, is a necessary condition for it being wrong to kill you. So he would say it's not wrong to kill an anencephalic child who's born without part of their brain and is going to die very soon. And he would say it's not wrong to have assisted suicide and euthanasia. Because they don't have a future of valued experiences. And he actually believes that's the strength of his argument. He doesn't want to have to bite those bullets. And for me as a Christian, I'm basically going to say, I think the future of value argument is true, but it's a sufficient condition for making it wrong to kill you, but it's not a necessary one. I think it's wrong to kill anencephalic children. I think euthanasia is wrong, but I'm going to use different reasons or different arguments to get there. So I think this is a true argument. I've given you 3 arguments that I think are all true and all pretty much work together, but I'm going to say that this is a sufficient but not a necessary condition for having it being wrong to kill you. I'm going to say one final thing and then we'll take a few questions. Christopher Kazor has a helpful reminder in his book, A Lesson from History. He notes that it's worth remembering that the long, sad history of the human race finds many instances of groups of humans dominating other groups of humans. Men have exploited women. Whites sold blacks. The young dispatched the old. The rich utilized the poor. The healthy overpowered the weak. And these cases are all nearly universally recognized as evil. It seems apparent that every single time the performance view has been chosen over the endowment view of human value, gross moral mistakes were made. And Kazor asks, do we really believe that for the first time in human history, we are justified in treating some human beings as less than fully persons? Or will we be judged by history as just one more episode in the long line of exploitation of the powerful over the weak?